Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. We're going to do some crazy stuff today. We're going to talk about Greek, strange, almost philological stuff you've discovered.
That's a good word for it.
Yeah, I would say there's some philology that's taking place. There's also just this cross-breeding of communication that's going on in the ancient world. And you and me have asked about our...
We're getting our James Fraser hats on.
That's, yeah. Like what's going on, cross-mythology, comparative mythology. Who came first, the chicken or the egg? Or was there chicken and eggs always, like what's going on?
Right.
Can
you even say what came first, chicken
right.
or egg? Yeah.
Now we're talking about the Bible, right? Did the Bible get inspired by Greek myth? We think so. But did that mean that it only took from Greek myth? No. And did the Greeks only have their own authentic, born in a vacuum ideas? No, they borrowed from the East,
right.
Which we know the Bible also has ancient roots in the Eastern thought. So this is that chicken or the egg, or who borrowed from whom. And I think this is going to maybe bother some of our friends, some of the people who want to say everything's borrowed from the Greeks or stuff. No.
There have been some classicists who pointed out that some of Homer's epics, in particular the Iliad, has a lot of elements that seem to be drawing from Babylonian epics.
For sure.
But they're personalizing it. They're making it about Troy. They're making it about the Achaeans. It doesn't mean that they're copying, but they're using sort of the same sort of technological framework that we find in these Babylonian epics. Maria Backfarova points out that the Iliad seems to have a lot of mimesis, a lot of things lining up mimesis-wise,
right,
between the Sargon epic and Homer's Iliad, and that being with Achilles filling that role. Having Achilles fill that role of like the great warrior.
Bruce Loudon, who wrote the Homer's Odyssey, or just Homer and the Near East. He actually makes the case in his book, which is like people need to get this book, shows that Homer is actually, this writing of the Odyssey and the Iliad is actually reacting to the Near East, and in fact, in a kind of polemical fashion. So it's indebted to, but also trying to kind of react to, fight against in a way. Just like people would say Genesis is fighting against the ancient Mesopotamian or Babylonian kind of ideas by making the peak of civilization, that ziggurat, actually the most negative thing. Whereas in ancient Mesopotamian thought, that's to become like the gods. And notice it's condemning becoming like the gods, which is why Adam and Eve should not have ate to become like the gods, all this kind of stuff. Whereas in ancient Mesopotamian thought, that's actually a good thing to acquire the knowledge to try and achieve being like the gods.
Another one, because this is good, we're showing that the influence can come from the East to the West.
Right.
The Greeks might be doing it and mastering the literary stuff, but they're also still being heavily influenced by Eastern thought. Another good example, Sappho, famous Sappho of Lesbos, where we get the term lesbian from. Is apparently, according to the historians, she was into women. She's from the island of Lesbos. So the term lesbian sort of came out of that.
Is that the island where there's only women on it? Or is that a different story? Remember the Greeks?
That's a different story.
Okay.
That's a cool story, though.
Yeah.
But Lesbos was part of the...
They killed all the men, right? Or something.
Yeah, it's part of the Aetolian area. They speak Aetolian dialect of Greek. It's in the north, closer to Troy, right off the coast of Asia Minor. And Sappho, one of the greatest poets of all time, lyric poets. Her song or performs with a lyre. I still read her lyrics in translation in English, and it gives me chills. But she has a specific story or poem, I guess you can call it a poem, about the death of Adonis and the weeping that Venus, or Aphrodite in this case, it's Aphrodite, let's stick with the Greek. Aphrodite weeping over the death of beautiful Adonis. And she's beating her breast, and she's mourning and wearing sackcloth and ashes. Well, guess where you find this literary motif of goddess weeping and beating her breast and wearing sackcloth and ashes over the death of a beautiful god?
Mesopotamia.
Ishtar and Tammuz. So Sappho, by the way, she's living in the 7th century BC, 600s BC. I think she was born in 630 BCE. This is ancient. This is before the Persian period.
Right.
The Babylonians are ruling, or it might be the Assyrians. It's either the Josh Bowen.
This is around the time
Sorry,
Homer...
Josh Bowen, I forgot. It's either the Assyrians or the Babylonians, but it's before the Persians are in control of the Middle East.
Right.
That's how ancient we are.
We're talking Homer is maybe
Classical
writing
period.
his works.
Oh, this is a little after Homer.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
this is a little after Homer. Homer's even before this.
Got it,
That's how old Homer is.
Right.
But we're talking 7th century BCE. We're talking, still the ancient world. It's classical period. But the Babylonians are still around, and their poetry is still out there, and she's hearing it, and she's Hellenizing it.
Got it. Or at least giving it a
Greekifying
setting.
it. Yeah, I use the word Hellenize because that's literally what it means. Even though people will say the Hellenistic period is 300. Well, if you're Hellenizing something, it's still the same thing.
Let me get in the weeds here with Adonis for 1 second in Tammuz, because this is a good jumping point to point out. We think biblical authors are doing this, but it's very muddy water, very gray, not black or white. When I listen to Fraser, right, trying to do these comparisons, and some people go, listen, he over-compared, right? He didn't know some of the things that we know now, which you can't fault anyone who just doesn't know certain things. We don't have certain text. But sometimes they might over-compare. We know, without a doubt, Tammuz, Adonis, clearly there's a connection in the myth. The question then becomes, and it's the same thing with Zalmoxis, Osiris, Dionysus, Bacchus. The question then becomes, when you start seeing these almost synonymous myths, I'm gonna use the word synonymous because for those who know, in languages, two terms may be used interchangeably, but oftentimes can mean something else. This is the complexity about these myths. Was there a Tammuz character in a myth, a god of a regional location that had its own context? Then Adonis, okay, who's a totally different god. And at some point when they found inspiration from the East, they took the model of mourning and the weeping and the aspects of course, we know about Ishtar, we can go back to Inanna, that they go half the year into the underworld and half the year up. This is agricultural. Is it possible that before the influence from the East, Adonis actually acted differently and had a different context and was a god with his own setting? So when they were inspired, they adopted the mythos and put that layer of cake on this god. So later, Greek authors see the parallels and then almost identify them as the same, even though technically, if we went back, just like you get accused this all the time, bro. How often do you go, look, Plutarch says Osiris is Dionysus, or another author might say
Herodotus does too.
Or Yahweh is Dionysus, or is...
And the reason why I point out Herodotus, because people will say, that's just a Hellenistic thing anyway.
Right.
Herodotus is in 450 BC.
Right,
So
right.
we have a 500-year period where they're saying this.
And why are they saying this? I think we're getting to something that's happening with myth making in cultures that are talking to each other. So first thing we want to just nail down for those who have kind of I don't want to say Greek supremacist as if it's some racist thing. That's not my thing. But I am trying to nail down that people have taken this as anti-Semitic in times where you're like, you only want the Greeks to be the ones they borrow from. We want to clearly say Greeks clearly were influenced by the East.
Sure.
And even
they say it themselves.
Right. So this is like, this is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But we also want to look and see, did the Bible borrow its mythology, its storytelling stuff from the Greeks
and then
as well?
I think there came a time when the Greeks sort of became the cool kid on the block, and everybody just wanted to kind of do what the Greeks were doing.
Right.
And I think that's fair to say, and I think a lot of evidence of that as well. Do you want to get into the birthplace of Dionysus?
Let's do it.
Because this is still east going west.
Yeah, I'm down. Let's do it.
So there's a quote from Homer. I have it right here. I want to get it right. It's
Awesome.
it's a translation.
And by
obviously.
the way, for those who don't know, you need to watch his video on Dionysus. I was privileged enough for Neil to hit me up and say, hey man, will you record you reading? I guess I have a decent voice.
Yeah.
Myself. He said, read these sections for me. And I read them, not memorizing or having the context, but this is an important quote from Homer.
Yeah. And this is, you actually said this quote. Should I play it? Just like
You can. Yeah, put it up to your mic in your chest.
There's a certain Nisa, mountain high, with forests thick of
Oh,
cedar,
read it again.
and Phoenicia afar, close to Egypt's stream.
Just read
All right,
it. Yeah.
just you can hear Derek's voice. Just a little funny joke.
Yeah.
But Derek said there's a certain Nisa, the birthplace of Dionysus. Dionysus breaks
Dionysus.
down. Oh, actually, let me do this first. The oldest inscription of Dionysus that we have, doesn't mean it's the oldest, but the one that we have, dates to 1250 BCE. So it's in the Bronze Age. It's in Linear B. This is before the alphabet. And it says Diwa Nusa. Zeus of Nisa, basically.
Okay.
He's Zeus's son, but Zeus just meant God. Dios is a word for God.
Right.
But it's also the genitive form of Zeus. So Zeus is like El. It's his name just means God. It's like that. Anyways, Dionysus breaks down etymologically as Diwo Nisa, the god of Nisa.
Right,
He's
Nisa.
born in Nisa. There was a pre-Socratic thinker named Pherecydes from Syros who believed that Nisa actually is an old Babylonian word for tree.
Okay.
So he's making this etymology stab and saying Dionysus is the god of the trees, the Zeus of trees.
Okay.
He's the swelling of the fruits, the swelling of crops, the growing of trees god.
Got it.
So that's interesting. That's another Eastern influence that he's pointing out. Pherecydes was from Phoenicia, by the way.
Okay.
This quote right here that Derek just read says, there's a certain Nisa, mountain high, with forest thick of cedar, in Phoenicia afar, close to Egypt's streams.
That's down south. So for those who don't know, Phoenicia's right there along the coast. Technically, Israel, Palestine. Like, it's that whole region that we're today seeing wars take place. And so when you're getting down toward Egypt, you're talking about Nile. You're in that deserty, Dead Sea kind of region in a way. But there's oasis along this path as well, where there's forest and things like that. So this is kind of hinting Homer, which is ancient, okay, not 12th, 13th century BCE.
But it's Iron Age.
It's old enough to kind of be harking back
8th
to
century
something.
BC.
And it's talking about a forest. So you talked about Nisa being a possible tree, or symbolizing this like agricultural trees. We were listening to Fraser talk about trees.
Right.
Holy smokes, that's something else we can get into about the golden bow and dealing with these gardens and these like, beautiful, lush locations, but agricultural. And then it gets into the Maenads a little, almost hinting at these nymphs, you were saying. What was their role again?
So they were these women that were living out in the forest, free from all society.
The nymphs.
Yeah, and they danced and played music and followed Dionysus around. They're like his disciples. But he also had male disciples called satyrs, who had horns with goat shaggy legs. And they had the satyrs and the Maenads and Dionysus, and they all ran. It's almost like kind of like Jesus with his Mary and Martha and Salome and his male disciples. So it was all, and by the way, and I'm not making this up, Clement of Alexandria points this out. He's contrasting both sides, saying Dionysus and his orgy-loving Maenads and satyrs are over in the mountains. He says, get away from all that. Come with Jesus with his disciples, where we're sober. Like
Right. They
get
celebrate
sober.
being sober-minded. And of course, the philosophy of the day is a major impact on this thought. That was Clement. So
yeah, and let me get back to Dionysus now, because he's talking about a region where Dionysus possibly might be from. And let me make this clear. There's a Nisa in Asia Minor. That's the most, people think that's the likeliest place where Nisa is. There's a story about Alexander the Great going there, and the people of Nisa were like, don't conquer us. This is holy grounds. Dionysus was born here.
Yeah.
So that's one of the locations. Then other people think it's Thrace.
right. So
The people who think it's Crete, which is a big one, which we're going to get into, because there might be more than one answer to this. But Homer is saying that Nisa is in Arabia, in between Phoenicia and Egypt,
right.
which could have been area of Zion, Judea, Israel, that region. So he's basically saying, like, what if he's talking about Yahweh?
Right.
So this is interesting. The oldest name of Dionysus, besides the one in Linear B, is Iakos or Yao. In the Chaldean oracles, it says that Dionysus was called by the Phoenicians Yao. He's also called Sabaoth, or as Plutarch translates that into Sabazius.
Got it.
There's this god Sabazius from Asia Minor, and they make this connection. A lot of scholars think that Plutarch might be wrong about this. We're just going to the sources.
Right,
We're just
right.
exploring the sources. Now, the Iakos that's found in Crete, as Karl Kareni points out in his book, was called Yawaka. So there's another, and there's debates on if this is Dionysus or not, or if it's something else. But we also know that the Philistines are Aegean people who populated the coast, and there's a possibility that Dionysus either comes from the east and goes to the west, as we were just pointing out and setting up, or he comes from Crete and goes to the east and through the Philistines, or even possibly through the Egyptians. Last thing I want to say, Osiris, as you pointed out, was equated with Dionysus by these early authors like Herodotus, and even all the way into the Roman period with Plutarch. So why are they equating Dionysus with Osiris? Well, he's this god of life and moisture, and the growing of crops,
Like fertility.
swelling of the fruits, fertility.
That's why there's
all that
orgiastic
stuff. That's why they
activity.
bring out phalluses for Dionysus, they bring out phalluses for Osiris. So there's the idea that Yo, the name of Yo gets applied to Isis and Osiris, and he's tied with the Apis bull. Yah in Crete is applied to Dionysus, who's also
bull.
tied to the bull,
Right.
the Cretan bull. In Israel, you have Yahweh
And El even.
tied to, he's synced with L,
Yep.
tied to a bull.
Yep. In
Yah.
fact, just to give you a fun little tip.
And last thing I want to say, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The names, the theophoric names in Israel, when you go back, it could be Yo or Yah. So it can be either or.
Right, right.
It's almost as if the southern Levant, Egypt, and Crete have some sort of combination going, some sort of commonality going among these gods, in a similar way that today the show The Office is in America, but in England, in
Right.
Britain, they have their own show The Office.
Simultaneously,
And they're
yeah.
both aired at the same time, going in their own direct. They're not borrowing from each other.
Right.
One of them might be first. I think the British one came first. But once the American version came out, they didn't keep copying the English cop. They went in their own direction. So that just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
People can have similar common roots with their gods, and they can just go in different directions.
Right, the cross diffusion of these ideas, and this is the question: like, when did, if we were to grant, because how old Osiris is, and these myths about Osiris are pretty damn old. If we were to grant that's older than Dionysus, then if we were thinking, well, how do these myths travel and find their way into the story? We have Titans shredding the body of the infant Dionysus, of course, and then he's reborn through the ashes when the Titans are destroyed, and here he is being reborn, right? When did that happen? How did that happen? And then you notice it takes a life of its own. So even separate from Osiris, it now has its own life, and they start to do things with that myth, and that myth continues. It's almost like, it makes me think of almost like the human body and how our bodies work when like scabs start to grow over and stuff. Like, it has a mind of its own now.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to think about healing a scab. Your body automatically starts to do it. Well, myths are kind of organic and develop and grow. But the one thing I wanted to mention that you mentioned about the bull, just to make a comment about this, in the Bible, as like Bible scholars will notice, some scholars have noticed that the golden calf story we have in Moses was a jab at El worship.
And it's coming out of Egypt in this story.
It's coming out of Egypt. It's this jab, though, that they're worshiping. It's like Northern Israel idea, which you also have in the stories of, I think, Josiah's reforms. They have these images of God in the form of a bull, and they're like condemning it. So it's this polemic. It's like a political polemic in the story to make you get away from the bull worship. Get away from the bull worship because God symbolized that bull. They don't want that.
Yeah.
And they want you here in Jerusalem.
Great point.
You know, these things. So ties into this because you and me have done this strange thing in Genesis with Joseph. And I just want to highlight that point. If Homer's correct that Dionysus, or a form of this myth, and he's just talking about one form, let's just say, because it can get pretty muddy real quick,
Right.
is here down in this region near Israel. And it's, by the way, near Egypt as well.
Right.
You have a story of Joseph.
He's very precise on his location.
Right.
In Phoenicia afar, by Egypt's streams.
So now, you know where that is?
That could be Zion, that could be Judea.
That's
it could be
right there
Israel.
near the promised land, according to the Bible. That's right there where the story of Joseph and Jacob takes place in Abraham, okay? Here you have this Joseph guy who technically was going to be killed by his brothers, thrown into instead of being torn into pieces like Dionysus or Osiris, there's a lot of overlap between Joseph, Osiris, and Dionysus in this story. And when he gets sold and he goes into Egypt and all these things, the dungeon section, when the woman takes his clothes off trying to have him sleep with her, in that section, he gives the dreams interpretation of the two guys. The one is the baker, okay, and then one is the wine bearer. You and me both know enough to know Dionysus is the blood. He's the grape. He's the wine. He is the wine, okay? There is no doubt. The people lost their minds over the Olympics with a purple dude on a table.
And
Anyone
it's
who
almost
knows
like
this,
him being sold by his brothers is almost like Zagreus being torn by the Titans.
right? It's almost like that. It's a little different. They've recontextualized.
But it's an allegory of death. He's being
It is
cast out
one-
of his family. He's being brought down into
But
Egypt, which represent. In a lot of cases, Egypt represents Hades.
But look
It's
at
the
Euripides
underworld.
Bacchae. What happens in that? They didn't know Dionysus was the son of God.
Right.
They didn't know he was there. He was in their presence, just like Jesus. They didn't know it was him.
He comes back to his family.
They
yeah.
didn't know that Joseph was him. Okay? There's this theme of
Cat-
delayed recognition.
Yes.
It's
By the way, Jacob, so sounding like Yakos. I mean, Yaakov.
That's a good
and
point.
that's one of the things I put out. But in speaking of that, Yaakov, Yakos, Dionysus, Jacob, right? One of the famous Bacchic chants that we have, you can find them on Perseus Tufts. Hesychius' lexicon has them all in there, are Ya, Yo, Ye, and Yu. It's almost like the vowels with a iota on it. And there are different Bacchic chants that mean different things. One of them is an Apollonian chant, Yay, but they're like exclaiming. They're like cultic
Hallelujah.
chants. It's like hallelujah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just like hallelujah. But that's what these are Dionysian Bacchic chants. Ya and Yo, it's like Yahweh. Like, so I'm just saying,
I know what you
sounds
mean.
similar.
yeah, you may not.
It may
but-
not, and it could be a coincidence.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth pointing out that the word for wine in Hebrew is yayin. So that's the name for wine.
Right.
There's a lot of overlap going on. I think there's a lot of cultural,
Crisscross. There's
crisscrossing
communication,
happening.
probably way back then, like you
and
said.
it's a wine culture.
So-
the Jews are all about wine culture. The Old Testament, I don't care if it's the Torah or if it's the Kings and Chronicles or the prophets, it's always talking about the vine of Israel.
Hallelujah.
Setting up your table, putting grapes on. The temple described by Solomon was set up with grapevines, golden grape clusters with satyrs on them. Satyrs are the guys who follow around Dionysus with the horns and I guess Josiah ripped all that down.
Got it.
So it's like they're coming out of the Dionysian roots.
Right.
It's in the text itself. So
This communication you're talking about makes me want to highlight something that is going to be coming out soon. We're doing a documentary on, and it was already done by a buddy, inquisitive Bible reader, if you haven't watched it, on the Philistines. Who are the Philistines? Well, many scholars think they're definitely associated with sea peoples in some way. And there are many scholars who notice the tribe of Dan, or the Danites, that there might be an overlap between the Philistines and the Danites, which
Homer mentions the Danaan.
and what's the Bible say? That Israel, one of the tribes of the
Seafaring.
tribes of Dan,
It's a seafaring
a
tribe.
seafaring tribe. So is this an etymological myth trying to unite the formation of Israel in some way? Because what happens is, notice the two major groups that get condemned. Canaanites, which we now know were Israelites, they're from Canaan. These literal people that we call Israelites were Canaanites.
And Asher sounds a lot like Assyria.
But the beef with the Philistines,
Right.
the huge red flag that people have asked. When you read the story of King David, notice when he flees Saul, he just joins the Philistines and then ends up being like up at the upper echelon of their group. Well, people have asked themselves, you can't just do that with enemy peoples unless they're so neighboring and so close and similar to you.
Right.
Then you could come and be part of them, because technically they weren't that different. They were one of you.
Right.
They were
They're
broken
Mediterranean
off part of
people.
same groups.
And guess what? I'm so glad you brought that up, because we were talking about Yahweh and the origins of Yahweh. I mentioned the oldest inscription of Yakos that we have from Crete. What about the oldest inscription of Yahweh that we have
In Egypt.
In Egypt, from the Shashu people.
Right.
It's so old that it's before Hebrew. It's in hieroglyphs, and it mentions Yahweh, Yah-O. It's actually spelled Yah-O.
Yep.
And it's the same spelling as the other one. And guess who is worshipped? Guess who the tribe of the Shashu is? The Midianites, who are the tribe the Midianites are the people who Moses flees to,
Right.
where he meets God for the first time in the burning bush. What do you know that the archaeologists who dug up the 5 Midianite cities, their pottery, guess where it's all from?
Sea peoples.
Aegean.
Okay,
They
so
have
it's sea peoples.
Aegean pottery. There is no Yahweh in the Ugaritic sources. Yahweh does not come from the north. He's imported from the south.
Got it.
Into Israel.
And that's really what the most consensus scholars say comes from
comes
Midian.
from the south. So
Right.
if that's true, if Yahweh is a Midianite god, and the Midianites are buying Aegean pottery and adopting Aegean,
Or they are Aegeans
or
in
they
some
are
way.
Aegeans, maybe they're cousins of the Philistines,
Right, or
living
something.
a little more in the desert than the Philistines, maybe not off the coast, more in the desert. That's possible, right? I'm not
get
an
it.
expert. I'm just guessing. But that's where Yahweh comes from.
Let me add.
So is he a Cretan god
Right.
that makes it to the Midianites and then gets imported to the...
This is the point I wanted.
I'm following that money trail.
We're
following the
speculating
trail.
here.
Yeah.
Have fun with us. We're speculating, okay? But it's a fun speculation because you and me both know that when we're trying to trace Dionysus' origins, one of the key aspects of his myth is that he's a foreigner. He's always coming in as a foreigner. He's foreign. Now, this is total... I'm playing Parallelomania in my mind to see if there's like a possible connection, speculation. But if these are sea people, some form they're traveling by sea and they're moving, maybe even a bit nomadic. Their deity is also a bit nomadic, just like Dionysus is a foreigner who comes from a different area he's like imported into the myth. People ask themselves, who is Yahweh? Where does he come from? What's his deal? He is a foreigner. He's a foreign god who comes into the land. Like he's not, in all of the story, in the myth of the Bible, he's not a local deity like El. He's foreign and then comes and usurps all of the qualities and all that was the entity of El and Baal. He takes all their attributes, but he's not from there. He's from another place. So I wonder, when I'm reading scholars, I'm going to worldhistory.org. So look, most accounts say he was born in Thrace, you brought that up, traveled abroad, and arrived in Greece as a foreigner. His attribute of foreignness as an arriving outsider god may be inherent and essential to his cults. Yahweh is 1,000,000% that. I'm playing Parallelomania.
No, you're right. You're right.
As he is a god of epiphany, sometimes called the God who comes.
What happens with Moses? Epiphany.
He has the burning bush experience. He was known as being of an Eastern origin himself, okay, according to the scholars. So his origins are uncertain, let's be fair.
And also the last thing, I already said this, but I want to emphasize, all throughout Old Testament scripture, we're talking about dozens of biblical writers, have the common theme of grapevine imagery. All throughout the text, you have Israel is a vine. You have the gladness of Israel during times of peace, where the tables are furnished with grapes and wine. They drink wine at the Passover. They drink wine at Sukkot. It's a wine culture. There's vineyards all over Israel. We saw the vineyard of Jezebel.
So we drank, I don't drink, but we went to a vineyard in Israel.
They're all over the place, and especially in the north too. It's a wine culture. It's a vine culture. So I would not be surprised if somewhere in their roots,
overlap.
And it doesn't mean they worship Dionysus or secretly worship Dionysus.
No.
There's some conspiracy. What we're saying is culturally, there might be a common ancestor going on.
Let's save them the trouble for one moment to think for those who are already going, oh, how dare you? Okay, did Yahweh, before being imported into Israelite worship, because we don't have him in Canaan, we don't have him in these Ugaritic texts, okay?
He's not there.
Before that, was he a storm deity?
He's not a Canaanite god either.
Was he the king of the gods? Was he sitting on the throne like El? No. Not as far as we have any evidence of. He might have just been like one of these El Shaddai deities that Francesca talks about in the Balaam inscription.
Yeah.
He might have been a lesser deity, just like Marduk usurps the throne and becomes king of the gods, okay? He may have been a kind of nobody god in the desert, somewhere in Midian, then ends up coming in. Dionysus gets imported. And he, of course, in the pantheon of all the Greek gods, he's like down here, but then he gets moved into the top.
But in his oldest versions of him, he's also a warrior god, not just a wine god. He's a war god. And that's how Yahweh is depicted in his oldest depictions too.
So this is why I'm like...
warrior, they both have life, like Osiris, moisture.
Right.
So...
And this may be Parallelomania on purpose. I'm purposely speculating here because you could have all of this stuff happening without necessarily direct communication. They could be in different areas where this stuff's happening. Look, we're playing Parallelomania on purpose. We're speculating on purpose, and this should not be a problem. I think we should be able to have fun doing this because...
As long as we don't sit there and go, I'm right, and all the scholars are hiding the truth from everybody.
No.
You know, sort of like
the
Grant Hancock thing. Look, if you're going to speculate, if you're going to go against the grain, be respectful to the people who spent their lives studying this stuff that might not agree with you.
Exactly. What I think is fascinating about what you do, Neil, and this is why I wanted to do this fun speculation fest on comparing Dionysus and seeing how we're not just doing this. You have highlighted the primary sources of Greek minds and other minds in an ancient world that are also, they were already doing this long before we even came on the scene. They were comparing these gods and saying Dionysus is Yahweh. Dionysus is Osiris. Dionysus, they were already doing this. So you're just saying, why are they saying that? And then we're speculating from there. That's all we're trying to do. But what you do that I think is fascinating and that I hope more people do from the classics department, some type of classicist communicating more with Bible scholars and not getting their panties in a bunch, because that's the problem I see.
Yeah.
Classicists don't want to get into the mush of Bible land.
But what bothers me about that is that all we're doing, and I should speak for myself. All I'm doing is I'm looking at primary sources and reading them and going, look, this is what this says.
Yeah.
I'm not even drawing. I'm not even saying this has to be true. This has to be true.
But you notice the
Give you
immediate
an
Plutarch's
example.
wrong.
Exactly.
That's
I was
what
going
they
to say
say.
Plutarch himself thinks that Yahweh is Dionysus.
Yeah.
In
Well,
the
he's
first-
wrong.
He's
That's
wrong.
what you get.
And that's the end of it.
That's the end of it.
I can't look at Plutarch now?
Why?
I can't ask why Plutarch thinks this?
Why?
Let me say what Plutarch says.
Yeah.
Plutarch is sitting at a table having a symposium with his teacher, whose name is Ammonius. Me and Amon joke about that. I'll be like, I'm Plutarch and you're Ammonius.
Right,
we joke
right,
around,
right,
you know what I mean? And his name is Ammonius, and he's another guy named Senechio and another guy. And they're all having fun, drinking wine. And Ammonius poses the question, and he says, who is the God of the Jews? And they all start to go along and go, his name, Adonai, sounds a lot like Adonis. I wonder if there's a connection there. Okay. Another one says the Sabbath, that comes from Sabazius. And another one says Yahweh is a form of Dionysus, who's called Iacchos. And in fact, this is what Plutarch says, in fact, not only does the Thesmophoria occur during the fall equinox, the Sukkot festival happens in the same exact week. And both festivals, the Thesmophoria, that happens over in Eleusis, they carry palm and myrtle into the temple, and they drink wine, and they furnish their tables with grapes. And the Sukkot festival, they do the exact same thing. They carry palm, and they carry myrtle, and they carry two other plants into the temple, and it's a same week. They do the similar rites.
As a Dionysus rite to
and
Yahweh.
people have pointed out that Plutarch's guilty of some parallelomania here too.
Of course.
Because there's major differences.
Of course.
Which we all know that's the case. There's differences, but there are similarities.
There's going to be in every cult.
Yeah. So he's seeing these similarities. There are sources that suggest that people are looking at Yahweh as a version of Dionysus. The Chaldean oracles is another one. We mentioned that earlier. Saying Yah-O is Yahweh, blah, 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 blah. We find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Greek version that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls uses Yah-O instead of Yahweh.
Muddies the water a little.
They take that away in the church Bibles, and they replace it with Kurios, the
Okay,
Lord.
right.
That's why all our Bibles say the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. Where in the older Greek manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they actually use the name Yah-O, which is the name that Dionysus has in one of his older versions.
So even the translators are interpreting it as almost
I don't
possible.
know if the Bible or if the
Greek translators.
the Greek translators interpreted it that way, but they spell his name exactly the same.
But that's what I'm saying. It's potential. It's a possibility that they're seeing overlap in their own linguistic paradigm that would have fit a Dionysus thing. And here they are kind of giving the same name.
Exactly.
Let me throw out a few parallelomania guesses, just throwing it out there like Plutarch, right? They're in the wilderness rather than going into the woods, okay, in Dionysus scene where they go out to celebrate and go into their orgy. They go out into almost an Exodus scene in the desert. There's a scene where Moses is ecstatic and he is dancing naked before the Lord, except he's not drinking wine and getting in an orgiastic fashion. He's naked. He's in the zone. He is dancing before the Lord completely nude, okay? You could get these little things, right? And this is all possible speculation, guesses, and you're throwing it out there. Rather than them drinking the wine out here in the Exodus, they get manna, okay? There's different things that occur.
This is a big one. Tacitus, in his book 5, called The Histories, talks about the Jews. He says the Jews are very wonderful, or not wonderful. He says he actually kind of makes fun of them a little bit. He doesn't like them that much.
Right.
But he makes them very interesting. And he says that they probably came from Crete and wound up in Egypt and then kicked out of Egypt. He tells this random story. He cites Hecataeus of Abdera, which is a lost text. So this might have been his source.
Right.
They came out of Crete, which is where Iacchos is. So there might be something there. They go into Crete. They get kicked out of Crete on the Oracle of Ammon, saying that they blame the Jews for a some sort of disease that broke out. And so they get kicked out of it. And they wander in the desert for 7 days. And after the 7th day, a pack of wild asses leads them to water. And then he says that's the animal they worship.
Right.
But then he later on goes,
Which is Set in
Set,
Yeah.
the donkey god or whatever. That's what he says. But then in another passage, he says, when Pompey the Great sacked their temple in 63 BCE,
Right.
he only found one thing in there, a golden ivy wreath, which is the symbol of Dionysus. And anyone who knows Greek mythology or Roman mythology, all the gods have their own crowns. So Aphrodite wears myrtle, Apollo wears laurel, Zeus wears oak, Dionysus wears the ivy.
Got it.
Why? So
He's the vine.
Tacitus says their God wears the ivy. Yahweh's wearing the ivy. That's what Tacitus says.
Got it.
He says, I've heard this rumor. This is what Tacitus says. I've heard this rumor that they worship some sort of Eastern version of Dionysus. But that's absurd because our Dionysus lets everyone be free. Their Dionysus puts everyone in bondage. So he doesn't like. So he knows the rumor.
Yeah,
he
yeah,
just
yeah.
doesn't like it.
He doesn't like it.
But it tells you something.
It says something.
It says something about what people thought about at this time period. And then there's another coin from that era, in 63 BCE, from Pompey sacking Jerusalem. There's a coin of a Jewish leader bowing to giving an olive branch to Pompey, and Pompey sitting on a throne, and it says Bacchus on it. So some interpreters say either it's some sort of Bacchus coin.
Or was Pompey imitating Bacchus?
It's hard to say, but Bacchus looks more like a name. So they think the guy's name who's bowing to, is the Jewish leader who's bowing to Pompey was named Bacchus.
Okay.
Which is like, why does he have a theophoric name of a Greek god?
Right.
So it's just something to point out.
Right.
I haven't figured out what that means yet. Last thing I want to say about these sources, there's from 139 BCE in an epitome in Latin. There was an incident that happened with the Jews living in Rome. So remember, a few decades before this, remember 139 BCE, Rome is still a republic. They didn't have the control of the whole Mediterranean yet.
Yeah.
But they're very powerful. And they have Jewish slaves because they defeated Antiochus III in the Macedonian Wars, and they took over the whole Mediterranean naval dominance. Antiochus had to give up 2 million Jewish slaves for the Romans to populate their cities with.
Right.
A bunch of them go to Rome. So fast forward to 139 BCE, they're having problems with these Jews. And Valerius Maximus says that, doesn't even call it Yahweh. He calls them the worshippers of Jupiter Sabazius. Jupiter Sabazius
Zeus'
is
son.
that Dionysian Zeus godhead.
Right.
Sabazius is the Eastern Dionysus,
Right.
who's from Anatolia. He's like a beer barley god, also like a plant vegetation god, Sabazius, right? So he says that he says that the Jews in 139 BCE were kicked out of Rome and sent back to Judea and for corrupting people with their fickle and he says like superstitious ways of worshiping Jupiter Sabazius. So he doesn't even say Yahweh. He doesn't even say El. He goes, it's Jupiter Sabazius. He's equating Yahweh with Jupiter Sabazius.
Right.
So it's Jupiter Dionysus.
These are all very interesting things that shouldn't just be hand-waved and go, oh, that's just Hellenistic, therefore there's nothing to the mind there. Because the reason I think this is powerful is whether or not the fact is these are the things that are actually the case. That interpretation in a Hellenized mind might actually be important when we're actually investigating late Second Temple Judaism, Maccabean literature, especially when you have like the statement about we are descendants of the Spartans as well. Like, there's this kind of, we come from the same stock and breed as you, trying to find common ground, but also that the New Testament is maybe potentially syncretizing some things to try and get Gentiles in as well in some way.
Yeah.
So we're not just writing a Jewish story. No wonder it caught fire in the empire over time. Like, they're writing a story that was just right for both Jews, or at least it depends, because you can go to some of the texts that seem to be anti-Jewish or condemn Jews. But it was really good that Gentiles heard this. It worked for the non-Jews real well.
Yeah.
No wonder it dominated by it. But
You mentioned Maccabees, and Maccabees, someone watching this might say, Maccabees gives a clear distinction that Dionysus is evil, because Antiochus IV brings in the abominable Dionysus into the temple.
Right.
So therefore, what you're saying
Wasn't
is
that
impossible.
Zeus, Bel?
It was Dionysus.
Okay.
The abominable. What you're saying is impossible. So we're talking about 150 BCE. And like I mentioned with the two shows, The Office and the British Office and the American Office, they go in different directions. We're talking 800, 900,000, maybe 1,200 years have gone by. If this connection is real,
Right.
let's say they do have a common ancestry. By the time you get to Yahweh and Dionysus, they're not the same cult anymore. They're indescribable. They're totally different at that point.
Okay.
So you could still have
Parallels.
Dionysus being abominable to the people worshiping Yahweh, and they don't even realize that they can have a common ancestry. I'll give you a prime example of this. The Romans worship Liber Pater, who they call Fuflos. It's a Dionysus god. It's a vine god, party god, beer, wine, and vegetation god. It's Dionysus, right? Mm-hmm. They got him from the Etruscans. They don't even know that this comes from Dionysus. When Bacchus from the Greeks gets imported in Italy, in 186 BCE, it freaked them out, the Dionysian orgiastic cults that were happening in the countries. They had to ban Dionysus in Rome, and they arrested people, executed people. There was a 10-year ban on Dionysian worship in Rome, while they're still worshiping Liber Pater.
So, okay, your point,
So you
let me
see,
spell
it's the same thing that Yahweh,
Right.
It could have been, I'm saying potentially, could be the same situation happening with the Maccabees, banning Dionysus, not knowing that their Yahweh has roots that go back to a similar god. In Latin, in Italy, they're banning Dionysus, not realizing that their Liber Pater is descended from the same god.
Right. So pointing back to a biblical example for people who might be interested in seeing, there's only one place that a Yahweh God is supposed to be worshipped, in Jerusalem. The writers of the text are clearly trying to say, these other temples with these other Yahwehs are not real.
Yeah.
Those are false Yahwehs
And Baal,
even.
too.
Right, and Baal.
They used to worship Baal.
Or even
now
like
he's the
I
bad
brought
guy.
up earlier with the golden calf, right? This symbolized El, this worship is completely not okay.
Yeah.
Notice that this is condemned to the point where they have the story, the earth opens up and swallows those who were worshiping that golden calf.
Yeah.
This was Israelite worship. And
Exactly.
It's its own culture being condemned.
Exactly.
So we can't rule out, unless we have some historical precedents to say, this is such a foreign deity that this really isn't Yahweh in some form.
That's what I mean. It's so important that we bring this point across, because just because in the Hellenistic era, just because in the Hasmonean period, they're like, no, pagans bad, Greeks bad, doesn't mean that, like, it doesn't null the fact that they could have common roots together.
And this
We're
could
in
be
a different time period with different people who don't know the history.
Right.
So-
But it also could be that these Hellenized Jews are adopting these ways of this deity more so, and the ones that are more conservative, which the Penn authors are the ones trying to paint the narrative, that notice there was battles going on between Jews and other Jews. There were Hellenized pro-Zeus, pro-Baal, pro-Dionysus Jews, and then you had those who were more strict, trying to conform to a completely different kind of version of the cult. This happens with the Zadokites and other forms of priestly groups, even in the Dead Sea Scroll communities. They are fighting for power and which form of worship and which way of law. Some scholars have argued that the Enochian literature, the 5 books of Enoch that we get compiled, is actually a different form of Judaism competing with the 5 books of the
Right.
Torah of Moses. Dude, nobody fights you more than the closest people to you. That's why I brought up earlier the Philistines. That's why I brought up the Canaanites. Notice they're the most condemned people. You don't give
It's
a
like
shit about the
Christians-
Chinese when you're over here, because they're not your closest enemies.
It's like Christians persecuting Jews in the Middle Ages.
Or even Christians persecuting other Christians today, or
Yeah.
arguing against them. Who
Yes, yeah.
Christians call other Christians not Christians more than they call atheists atheists.
Yeah.
Because we're not like that close. We're close,
Yeah.
but we're not that close. It's the people closest to you need to look at. So if you take your psychology, kind of a sociological approach like you're saying, and apply it to what happened with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and say, he wasn't just importing a foreign god. He was importing a god that other Jews were on board with.
Right.
And
That's another important part.
This
yeah.
is what I think happened after 70
He might have
AD.
been trying to unify the Dionysian cults.
Well, you know what happened in 70 and then the Bar Kokhba, right? And then they built the temple to Jupiter. Not all Jews were against that temple of Jupiter, but there were a lot that were. So like,
It makes you wonder if Valerius Maximus was actually referring to a Roman Jewish cult called Jupiter Sabazius. He could have. So most people would
Worth
say he's
investigating.
equating, which is probably the case.
Yeah.
But we don't know. In Rome, they could have had a temple to Jupiter Sabazius.
Yeah.
They could have been doing their own sacred. We don't know what the Jews in Rome were like.
Right.
We just have a couple sources. We just don't know.
But if you have this Hellenistic stuff happening, look at Josephus, the most central character of their religion, Moses. What does he do? He has him written, Josephus says in his own pen, he didn't die. God took him and he had this apotheosis. He ascended and became metamorphosized. He became divine, okay? Why would you have Moses when your text in the Torah says Moses died? It even says more strictly in the Hebrew, God buried him, but the later authors with their sensitivities of the unclean dead, God can't touch that. God also follows the Torah law that he didn't bury him. That's like, they're covering that up in our translations, by the way. This is Francesca Stavrakopoulou in God and Anatomy. She points this out. But he dies. He cannot go into the promised land. Josephus rewrites the myth of Moses where he actually doesn't die. He's taken up. Now, why would he do that? He's writing against Appian. He's arguing his Jewish kind of ideas against the others, the Roman ideas and stuff, and trying to say, no. We got good stuff. We have a hero named Moses. He didn't die. He was metamorphosized. He was taken up. So they're literally willing to change their own stories to match Hellenistic thought.
This is going to bring us into this next amazing point. In our recent video, we talked about dating the Torah. When does Moses show up in the sources?
Right.
He might show up around 300 BC for all we know. Well, it's funny because some of the earliest Jewish sources in Greek equate Moses with a figure named Musaeus, who's from Athens. Musaeus is one of the oldest literary figures that we find in the sources of the pre-Socratic thinkers. He's mentioned by Plato often. He's known as the son of Orpheus. He's known as the father of Linus, and these are pre-Socratic Orphic sages who are lawgivers, polymaths, great sages. This is Musaeus. Musaeus is a lawgiver, like Moses.
He's before Pythagoras?
Wait, yes.
So this is
Yes,
important.
he's 9th century BC.
This makes me think of the debate. I'll keep your train of
We don't
thought.
even know if he exists.
I just want to throw this to you, though.
Yeah, he might be
Because you know
legendary.
how the later debates become Moses taught, we believe Moses taught Pythagoras and Plato and all these guys. What if the Jews are co-opting this earlier Greek figure?
That's what I'm getting at.
Okay.
So this guy, Aristobulus of Alexandria, is one of them. Another one is Theodotus. And there's a third source from the Hellenistic period. Around 200 BC, they're writing this stuff. To 100 BC, somewhere in that period. And they're pointing out that Moses is the teacher of Orpheus. So they flip it. Instead of in the Greek Athenian stories, Moses is the son of Orpheus. These Jewish authors in Alexandria are saying that, no, Musaeus is actually our Moses. Who you guys think is Musaeus of Athens is actually our Moses, and he taught Orpheus. And that's how you guys got your wisdom. Eusebius picks up on this. Eusebius tries to argue that Plato and Pythagoras and all these and Socrates were all taught by Israel,
Right.
Taught by the Jewish prophets,
By Moses.
through Moses, through Orpheus.
Right.
That's how it got it. That's how Athens got so wise.
It's a clever
It's clever.
apologetic, but it also makes me wonder now if we're starting to mix in Moses with this, you said
Musaeus.
Musaeus.
It makes you
Is this
wonder.
guy-
It honestly makes me wonder if Moses, the name Moses, or the origins of Moses, was inspired by Musaeus.
Right, that's what I'm wondering.
Especially if it's true. If it come to find out, let's say we're right, and Moses is a new addition to the Jewish culture
Right.
around the time of Alexandria being built.
Right.
All of a sudden,
This would
that's
make
fair
a lot
game.
And is Musaeus in any way connected to the Muses?
Yes, that's what his name means.
Okay.
His
So
name is of
Musaeus,
the,
Muses.
his name means of the Muse.
Okay. And anyone
So
who
he's getting the oracles from the Muse and revealing it to the people. He's a lawgiver. He's a famous, legendary lawgiver, just like Moses.
Is it fair to say, if we were looking, when you talk to a modern Christian, they say, I felt the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Spirit filled me. That day, the Spirit, those things, the Spirit entering a person where they feel the Spirit, that is the muse. In the Greek context, it is the muse that fills you, the muses kind of thing. Is that the equivalent, or am I falsely equivalent?
That's
Okay.
inspiration of
The
being
inspiration.
inspired by the gods. Plato gives 3 gods that control the Muse. the 9 muses. There's 9 muses, and they're all the 9 muses are the goddesses of like poetry, music, comedy, drama, theater, writing, history. That's Cleo. Cleo's the muse of history. That's 7, and I think there's 2 more that I can't think of right now. Anyways, Plato lays out who these 9 muses are, and he says there's 3 gods that control the 9 muses. So 3 gods get 3 muses each: Dionysus, Aphrodite, and Apollo. And so he says that the muses inspire poets through the 9 muses, through these 3 gods. And the inspiration of the poet writes it down and
psalmist, in a
performs
way.
it like a psalmist.
Got it.
In fact, that's the next thing I want to say. And that's how the divinely inspired poets are writing their psalms.
Right.
The Septuagint, there's an extra psalm at the end. They call it Psalm 151, and it's very Orphic. David is playing his lyre and calming the storms and calming the animals around him, and it's very much like the picture of Orpheus playing his lyre.
Right.
And this is a famous picture of Orpheus with animals all around him. It's in the ancient mosaics found in the Hellenistic period. So some people have pointed out that the 151st Psalm might be an Orphic inspiration of David. But even deeper than that, right around the same time period, what they're finding in Alexandria are Orphica fragments, which are Jewish authors writing about Orpheus as their own prophet, being the son of Moses. So Moses is the father of Orpheus, or Musaeus is the father of Orpheus. But these Jews are writing Orphic texts. Do you have James Charlesworth's Pseudepigrapha?
I don't have it on me, no.
James Charlesworth's Pseudepigrapha, it's right in there.
It's in the computer.
He has a whole section on Orphica, dating from the 3rd century BCE
Right.
to the 1st century AD. And these are Jewish texts written with Orpheus, who's a revealer. It's apocalyptic literature. He's revealing things. He's an apocalypse. He's a theologian. And he's also the son of Moses.
So there's this.
So they're claiming Orpheus as a Jewish prophet.
Right. So there's so much. I feel like we're like touching little pieces of a puzzle, but we're like the whole face. We don't have enough, right, to be so confident and like to plug it up, but we're speculating. And this is the fun part about this entire episode, because there's some of this is not just speculation, but we're speculating using those assumptions to go further.
It's not speculation to say that there were Jews claiming Orpheus as a prophet. That's a fact.
I'm saying like the picture we're trying to put together, right? We're trying. It's fragmentary, but we're trying. What I wonder is how much of this picture, when we see the clear debates between almost saying Roman and Greek, let's just say supremacy or Jewish supremacy in terms of ideas, that the Jews were saying ours is older. They're like trying to go older because older is better to them.
Right.
Even Rome saw the Jews as a good ancient religion. Christianity got condemned because it was new. They're like, this ain't ancient, this is new. And that's why Christians try to harp on the ancient pedigree. But they were not. They were recent. And that's what made them this like, even Romans, not fans of Jews, couldn't argue with their antiquity at least. I think
Little do they know. Little do they know.
Little do they know, yeah. They're fabricating a lot of this antiquity,
they're
maybe.
just as old as you guys.
But that might have been what hyped them to kind of root these ancient stories. We're talking about the myth of Curta, ancient stuff, and incorporating it into this later compilation we call the Bible. So there seems to be this debate, polemic, whatever you want to call, that's going on crafting as Plato talks. You want to build a nation, you want to build an eternal kingdom, an eternal nation, make a fabricated ancient story with your gods from the beginning. Yeah.
Plato says if you want a republic to be successful, you need to have laws that are given down by the gods and are more ancient than anyone else.
Exactly.
And he says you have to have these noble lies, and the only people who are allowed to use a noble lie is a ordained priesthood.
Right.
You know what's also funny about that passage? The guy says to Socrates, who is it? Says to Socrates, he says, well, what kind of noble lie? He goes, some sort of Phoenician myth. Makes you go, what?
Yeah, they all pull.
And he never goes on what that means. He just goes on to the next topic. He just real quick. Some sort of Phoenician myth that everyone knows. That's what he says. And then he sort of gets into another thing. But it's what? Yeah. And I read that passage. I go, what does he mean by Phoenician? Why is that there? I'm just telling you, check it out. It's in Republic Book 3. Read it for yourself. Noble Lie, Republic Book 3. But last thing I want to get into, I don't know how much time we have, the Eva thing that Clement of Alexandria points out.
We need to talk about that.
So I mentioned these Bacchic chants, Ya, Ye, Yo, Yu. These are Bacchic chants that they sing like hallelujah, right? Another Bacchic chant that they also chant at these festivals was Eva, Eva, and it means life. It means it's Zoe means life, but in the Septuagint, the name Eve,
Mother of life.
They call her Eva, but they also call her Ewa. Or I'm sorry, they call her Zoe, but they also call her Ewa. And there, Clement of Alexandria points out, he says, Eva, Eve, is the name of the Bacchic chant that the Dionysian cultists call out. Mm-hmm. And he says this is so crazy what I'm about to say. Clement of Alexandria explains that Eva is the shout that the Dionysian cultists proclaim that is basically praising Eve for eating the fruit that the serpent gave her, right? Because the serpent, Dionysian, all this imagery pointing out.
And you have like apples of Apollo. You have all sorts of cool stuff.
Yeah, you have all sorts
Greek
of
myths.
imagery involved in this. But what's so wild about this is not only is Eva connected to Eve and also connected to the Dionysian cults, but
And we aren't doing it. Clement's connecting.
this.
Right.
But it turns out that Eva is also a title for Persephone.
Right.
Persephone is the one who goes down into Hades. She gets taken and brought down by Pluto or Hades, and she eats the pomegranate while she's down there. Instead of being kicked out of paradise like Eve, she gets stuck in Hades forever or for parts of the year.
Yeah.
And she's the queen of the underworld.
Similar to Ishtar.
And she's called Eva.
Right. So this connects in a weird way to Ishtar, Inanna.
Yeah.
Like there's this ancient root that the Greeks are obviously inspired by the East, but we're finding, it's almost like inspiration's going back and forth. And then you find Hellenistic period where you actually have two parallel lines of things that are happening, it seems. And the Hellenistic people are fusing them in a way.
Yeah.
But Clement's goal is to condemn.
He's pointing this out, but he's also saying, see how wicked they are?
Yeah, they're the bad version of it. We have the true version of it.
However, obviously Hava in Hebrew means life. So Eve, Ewa, the chant, the life. I think it points to even though one's Semitic, one's Indo-European, I think there's more overlap, even though the language families are separate.
Right.
I think culturally there's more overlap. Another thing is Adam. Adam in Hebrew is, red or dirt or earth, right? Earth, because earth is usually red or dirt. So it's something connected with the earth being red and dirty, like whatever. Adamus in Greek means indestructible. And in the Samothracian mysteries, the primordial god, the first god that's created, is Adamus.
This is an important...
and so his name is indestructible probably because something along the lines of life is indestructible.
Right.
Life, Ewa, Zoe, is taken off of the rib of Eve. And so the Samothracians said that the names of their gods were pre-Hellenic, Pelasgian, they say. Mm-hmm. So Adamus is a Pelasgian word, that means indestructible. Parmenides also talks about the four elements that are used by God to create the world. He uses the word Adamus, indestructible.
Right.
So, so in the Sibylline oracles later on, Adam is called the four-lettered Adam. So you almost wonder, four elements, indestructible, Adam.
Yeah, and they may be playing some they may be doing it, which is what we're also highlighting.
And that's what I'm saying. Even though you and I are doing this, we're looking at these sources, we're speculating. Everything we've brought up today was from the primary sources.
Yeah, so you can the viewer might say, I don't think that connection holds water. Okay, that's fine. Because now you got me thinking of the Ugaritic example of the myths of Adamu, Adammu, and...
Remember, the Pelasgians are saying, or the Samothracians are saying, that their word for indestructible is pre-Hellenic.
Right. Well, you were talking about how we need to pull from, if we were just using Plato's thing, right, we need to pull from Phoenician myth. Well, we're dealing with Ugarit, okay, so we're dealing with Canaanite Phoenician territory right here on the coast, where a figure named Adamu was found in an inscription. There's a recent book that I did a documentary on with my buddy from Inquisitive Bible Reader, Paul Davidson. And when you dive into this myth, these two authors, specifically of the book, take a different view. It's a very difficult to decipher, broken up tablet, KTU 1100 and KTU 1101, or I can't remember the exact number of the second one. Either way, in these tablets, they think it's a myth, not just a magical incantation against how to get rid of like poison from a snake bite. They think it's a story, a myth of a character named Adamu, the first created. He's actually has immortality. So he's an immortal human that they send down to the garden. Yes.
There's the indestructible.
So he's an immortal human,
That's
and you should
crazy.
check this out deeper. But
That's
he's
crazy.
the mountain of the gods is where the gods are, right? I can't remember if it's Zaphon. One of these mountains they're on in the myth. They send Adamu down, and in this one he's a male. In some versions, Adamu is actually a female. So here you have this intersexual, possibly different sexes. Adamu goes down to the garden to try and like get rid of the serpent because he's put a fog over the garden and is creating chaos and destruction of the garden of the gods. When they send him down there, he gets bit by the serpent and then loses his immortality. Well, how do we fix this? Well, there's an underworld god. The underworld god's named Haranu. And to this day, there are names in Israel of local locations that have that name, that theophoric name in it. Haranu, the west and east or something. That's the underworld deity in this ancient Ugaritic myth. So what happens is they make a pact. Hey, if you can get rid of this snake, Haranu says, I'll get rid of the snake.
Osiris and Dionysus are underworld deities in there.
So this is powerful stuff. Haranu makes a pact with the gods on the mountain and is pissed, kind of like, I'm in this underworld area, like, I'll only get rid of the serpent. And in the myth, it might even hint that Haranu sent the serpent. Okay, but anyway, they make the deal with the gods. If I can marry one of the goddesses of the mountain, I'll get rid of the serpent. And by doing that, he sends his magical spell, and he gets rid of the serpent. So they make a pact with the underworld. This shit is so deep, dude. I love this stuff.
This brings it back full circle to we were going from east to west. Now we're going to west to east.
Yeah,
now we're back to east to west. Last thing I want to say about that, about this god, underworld god, and serpents. Because we mentioned Eve and Iwa, and they carry the Dionysian people carry serpents. The females always have serpents entwined around them. Well, Ningishita is a Babylonian god who's considered to be a twin of Tammuz. He's an underworld god, and he's depicted as with a tree. He's a tree god
with a serpent,
with a serpent coiled around it.
Yes.
And it's like if Dionysus really was the Dionysa, god of the tree. It could literally be a translation of Ningishita, which means Ningishita means Lord of the Tree.
Okay.
That's what the name means.
Right.
So the Lord of the Tree, and then you have him if he's and him being a twin of Tammuz. Tammuz is like also a vegetation palm tree god. So
there's something
going
on.
And it brings us back to James Frazier.
Right. And other people,
agricultural here.
M.L. West writing his stuff, showing, what was the name of that book? It's a famous book where he shows imported myths from the East into Greek mythology, and that's a fascinating one to get into.
So if I had to conclude this, I would say the Babylonians and the Sumerians are obviously the oldest Copper Age to
with
Bronze
Egyptian
Age cultures.
too.
The Mycenaeans come on the scene. The Minoans are around at the same time as the Sumerians. Actually, I shouldn't leave them out. So you have these cultures, right? Minoans, that's where Crete is. Dionysus is coming out of that region. But the Babylonians are the cultural center of the world at this time period, and all of their ideas are spreading west. Hammurabi brings everything to the west. And then you get the Hittites, you get the Mitanni, you get these Indo-European,
Hurrian,
Indo-European cultures, and Mycenaeans come on the scene. Eventually, by the time we get to the Iron Age and Classical periods, it goes. So the influence is going that way, from east to west. By the time we get to the Classical Iron Age period, so from 1000 BC up until the Common Era.
By the way, just to make this very clear, you might even go further east and say some of that further eastern stuff may even be influencing over here.
Yeah.
And that's another thing we haven't even opened the can of fully discovering.
Yeah. And
go ahead, sorry.
No, and that's a good point. And I think if you even go back even farther than the Copper Age, late Stone Age, it's the Indo-Europeans moving down.
That's exactly what I was going to get into.
Indo-Europeans moving down,
Yep.
influencing Semitic people and all that stuff. Anyways, eventually by the time we get to the Iron Age and the Classical period, the influence starts to go the other way around. Like I said, we find the coins of Athena in Judea.
Right.
We find so the Greeks are starting to influence everyone else, and it stays that way up until the Romans and all that. But like I said, you have influencing going from this way and then going back the other way.
Right.
And then
it might do this by then.
So what
you don't know,
you end up
it's
with
a
a culturally rich Mediterranean / Mesopotamian world.
Which is why there's no problem
with
for looking
mysteries.
for these connections, bro. Because, you know, who knows who, when. There might be ways scientifically and using good method to figure out this particular myth looks to predate and had directly influenced. That genetic stuff, in a lot of cases, particularly, is difficult when you're dealing with myths that float around. But looking for the connections, without even dying on a hill of genetic connection. This had to have been the one and this one first and all that. Let's stop that. Unless you have a way of proving it, let's not pretend that is the case. The real case, I think, and that's what apologists and often want to try and point, you can't prove that one borrowed from this one, because they want to try and act like Bible's earlier, a lot of them, the more fundamentalist ones. Bible's earlier and they borrowed from them, because that somehow in their head makes them think it's truer or something.
Right.
And myths are myths, and they're borrowing. If you could just show that there's a commonality of genre, there might be themes about it, it might be apocalyptic myth, it might be theophany myth, it might be delayed recognition myth. Bruce Loudon goes into like 13 categories of myth. And he shows cross-culturally how Homer and the Near East, these myths throughout the Odyssey and the Iliad, are literally found in the Bible, are found in earlier Babylonian myths. The list goes on and on. For me, that's enough to go, walks like a duck, talks like a duck. That's like walking into a comic book store, jabbing at my friend Michael Jones. Just gotta punch him back here a little just to make the point. It's like walking into a comic book store. You got myth after myth after myth. You got Marvel, you got Capcom, you got, you name it, okay? And in the middle of it, you have this one magazine that is literally doing what the other ones do. And you have to tell me you're not special pleading when we open that one up, especially when it's Johnny come lately. We got Superman's way older.
Right, it's the newest one.
It's the newer,
it's the newest one.
I wouldn't even say newest. Let's be fair and say it's in the middle, because the myths after it maybe have been influenced by this in some way. Because Christianity influences others as well. Once they get on the scene, they start gaining power. The point I'm getting at is they want to pretend you can open this one, born of a virgin. Every other comic book has like divine births, whether it's in sexual union. Some aren't in sexual union. You have golden showers, which is not a sexual union. You have other examples where Plato and Plutarch is literally born of a virgin. You have other examples. My point is they want to pretend you can open this book and go, oh, this is the true magazine. It's so special pleading. Instead of just valuing all the myths for their good, their bad, and their ugly, just enjoy mythology. That's what I want to do. I'm not here to make everyone believe like me or lack belief like me. Screw that crap. If the world was like that, it'd be dull to me. I'm glad someone comes on and goes, you know, I kind of like believing in Adonis. Or I like to think maybe there's something to Inanna's myth that enriches my life or something like that. Cool. You know, I find value in the story too, even though I don't believe it literally. These stories, we learn lessons from, we can learn our rich past, but when you demonize every culture around you, special pleading your own, you have lost so much humanity. And that's what I want to give with Myth Vision, bro. And I think I need to show that more. While I'm critiquing...
Muse Vision.
Muse Vision. Yeah, man. You do the same thing, and I appreciate that with you. You're not just doing anti-apologetics, and people know that I do that. But why do I do that? This is the why.
It's important.
We need to take back our culture, and our culture is humanity at large. We need to understand all of them and value all of them. If they're all speaking mythology, call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
When you're pretending yours isn't, you're being deceitful to yourself and to everyone who watches. And I'm tired of that. So that's why I fight back.
That was great. Well said.
Any final words from you, bro?
I can't even top that. That was great. Like you said, bring back the culture. Influences the religions that are around today. Don't you want to know what the sources are? Don't you want to go back to the oldest roots? You claim yours is the oldest roots. Don't you want the real deal? Something to think about.
Thank you. You have just attained
True gnosis.